Hey, welcome back to Geek Toolkit. I'm Joe Farrow, and this is episode 4 of the Home Assistant Setup. It's 2021. Very excited to be into 2021. I will also be very excited when haircuts come back, but I took a quick break and I'm back. We're going to get into automations today, which is super exciting because automations is where we actually get to do stuff. Up until now, it's been pretty excruciating to make the videos knowing that up until now, we haven't been able to do anything with the entities and devices that we've been creating. I showed you how to set up cameras, but really doing all the cool stuff requires automations. Automations requires logic, and we have to know how to do that. This video, we're going to get into all of it. Now, if you've been following my video tutorials, you know that I like to get into the lingo and a little bit of the logic behind it before we get you there. So let me do something to warm you up with a couple of quick demos of understanding what is it that we're trying to do here. Now, there's what's called home automation, but what I like to call smart home automation is where we take multiple inputs to make a decision. I'll give you an example. Think about like cars that, you roll up the window, you've got your, basically, the old school days, we had a window knob that you'd have to turn to roll the window up. Later on, you had the automatic button, you had the electric windows that went up and down. And then eventually you got to the point where you could hit one button like just once, you give it a tap and it goes all the way up or all the way down. You can consider that a form of automation. But where things got really smart is where they added sensors to do things such that if it rains, the window would roll up automatically on the car. Now you've got a smart automation for the car. Now let's take that and apply it to homes with a very similar concept of walking in and having a motion sensor turn on a light. And you had the old school, like flip the switch to turn the lights on. I say old school, but we still use them. But that's the manual way of doing it. And then you had the motion sensors that replace those, and when you walked in, the light would turn on. Now that's pretty cool. You kind of feel like it's automated. You're carrying the laundry, you walk through the house, and your lights are turning on as you walk through rooms. That's kind of neat, and they turn off behind you. But what about the time where you get up in the middle of the night to go get something, or you're checking on a noise or whatever, and the light turns on full brightness because it detects motion? That's not so smart. That's just automation. That's not smart home automation. Now, with something like Home Assistant, and the reason I'm bringing up these scenarios, we can go a step further. The motion sensor is the trigger. That's what starts the automation. But the next part of the automation, we can have a condition. And we can say something like, if it's after 10 p.m., let's turn the lights on 20% so that it doesn't blind us. That's where a smart home automation comes in. And that's the kind of stuff we're going to talk about. And I say that because I want you to think about things in that way, because this will make much more sense when I explain conditions and triggers and actions and blueprints and so on about why there's so much that goes into actually automating a home. This is really what takes you a much further step from, some people will say, oh, I automated my home, and they talk to their smart speaker, their speaker turns their lights on, they're like, ta-da! And that's cool. Don't get me wrong, but we're talking about a much more interesting, much more complex, and much more powerful and efficient way of doing automations when we talk about Home Assistant and the automations it's capable of. The next part of this, we're going to talk about the concepts in the lingo. The first part is triggers. Triggers are what start an automation. In Home Assistant, it has built-in triggers such as things like where the sun is. For instance, say you want to turn your lights on after dark every day. Instead of turning them on at 10 p.m., we could turn them on when the sun goes down, because we know the sun goes down at different times throughout the year. So by having a trigger of sundown instead of a time, that's much more powerful for something like lights. Now, sometimes you do need something to happen at a certain time, and there is a time trigger also in Home Assistant. There's also an NFC trigger called tag, so you can swipe an NFC card and have an automation kick off. There's things like geolocation, which means when I leave my home or when I enter a certain area, maybe I enter this zone that I've designated as work, I want to have some automation kick off. You can do that as well. You can also do things like when an entity enters a state. And what that means is, remember, our entities are our devices, and I could have like a light switch. When that light switch, when it changes state from off to on or vice versa, I can kick off other automations. I use that one personally a lot because I love the idea of my light switches being much more powerful than just what they're connected to. When I turn my light switch on in my room, it also turns on LED lights, it can turn on my television, it can turn on a number of other devices. And when I leave my room, I can have my light switch turn off my TV as well, which is super handy. Now, normally that light switch and TV would never be able to communicate together, but with home automation, they are able to. And that's where we take things and we start tying things together. The next thing we're going to talk about is conditions. Conditions make sense to people because you've heard the phrase, I'll let you do that under one condition. And if that condition's true, then you take the action. Home automation is the same way. The conditions have to be true, and there can be one more of them. Or there can be no condition. The condition is totally optional. But again, a condition is what can make something a lot smarter. This is where we would put in something like, if the light switch is hit on and it's after 10 p.m., turn the lights on at 20%. Finally, let's talk about actions. Actions is where we actually do stuff. Actions are where you do stuff like turning on a light, or maybe start recording whatever's coming off your security camera, or notify me over a phone message. An action's where something happens. An action can also be something like turn the TV on when the trigger of hitting the light switch is on. That would be an action. The action's where stuff happens. What we're going to do now is actually show demonstrations of this in the user interface. I'll walk you through setting up a couple automations so that you can see what it looks like now that you know the lingo. All right, now we actually get to do this in the user interface. Here's my home screen. You can see I've got this multi-sensor, this 4-in-1. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's bring it up. We're going to go to configurations, devices, and here is my 4-in-1 multi-sensor. This is a monoprice sensor. It's a rebrand of another one. It detects brightness, which is your light level in the room, humidity, temperature, and motion. The motion thing we want right here is this multi-sensor 4-in-1 alarm. See, when it's set to 255, that means it sees motion. When it's at 0, it doesn't. So I'm going to click on that. Just note that entity ID there. We're going to use that in a second. To create an automation off of this, I can just click this plus sign here, and it'll give me some samples. Now, this is one of the things I really like about the new UI in Home Assistant is it tries to help you create automations that make sense right off the bat. And if you click on any of these, it will create a template. So you can see when the temperature changes, well, I can click on that, and there's my template for that to get me up and running with the trigger already set. We're going to give this a quick name. You can name and give your descriptions to keep everything nice and organized. We're going to just say stairwell lights on motion to let us know what this is for here. Now, the idea here is when the motion's detected, the lights turn on. So we can go with our triggers and take a look through some of the ones I already talked about. I talked about sun, tag is the MQTT one. There's time and patterns and so on. Webhooks, you can have a HTTP request do this. Zone is based on where you're located. This is geolocation. There's a lot here. What we're going to do, let's see, I think state is what I want. I'm going to paste that entity ID in there. And I'm going to say that when the value goes from 0 to 255, then that's my trigger. That's when I want my automation to kick off for that entity. And we'll go down here for conditions. Now, I talked about making things a little bit smarter, so let's take a look at some of the conditions here. You can see that you have and, or, and not. And means that if you have multiple conditions and they're both true. Or means if you have multiple conditions and only one are true, to go ahead. And then not, of course, means, if it's not true. You can trigger on state, sun, zones, again, time, and so on. So you've got quite a bit here to do for your triggers. We're going to do a time-based one. And I'm going to say after 10 p.m. Now, the time is in 24-hour format. So I'm going to add 12. So 2200 hours. That would be 10 p.m. And I'll say that after that, and you can see the day of the week popped up. Now, notice this whole UI is based on your condition type. If I selected something else, that UI would change dynamically. It's very, very smart, which is really nice. And that is our time. Now, our action, what do we want to have happen here? Well, I'm going to say I want the makerspace light. So let's see, we've got a couple different ways we can do this. We can call the service of light on. We can actually go to the device, and when I bring in makerspace, it already knows actions that make sense. Turning it on, turning it off, increasing or decreasing the brightness. There's also toggle, which means it'll just flip it from whatever it is. I'm going to go with that and click save. And now I've got my automation created for my stairwell lights on motion. Now I talked about a second way of creating an automation. Let's talk about that for a second. If you click on configurations, we went into devices here. We can also go directly into automations here. And if you click on automations, you'll get a slightly different UI. Now, if I click on add automation, I get two windows here, and we'll talk about blueprints in a second. But this one here uses what's called Almond. And what it is an AI where you can type what you want it to do, and it will try to figure out all of the entities for you. So I can say when motion on camera, start recording, and then I can click create, and it will try to figure out something. Now, it doesn't always work. In this case, it didn't find anything for my devices because I didn't give it a good name. That's okay. We click OK here, and now we're back into our automation UI, and we've got our triggers and so on. I'll take this opportunity to go over this mode right here. This is an important one. Say your triggers fire multiple times. For instance, I have a trigger on motion and say it fires once and then it fires again a second later. What the mode is how to handle that second firing. Now, single, it will run once. Restart means that whatever the automation is, it will stop what it's doing and start over from the beginning. Queued means that it will actually queue up each time and queue up behind the automation. When the automation is complete, it will do the next one. And parallel means it'll actually kick off another thing at the exact same time. So it's just a nice thing to know of how the automations are handled if you multiple triggers get fired off at the same time. All right, now we're going to go back into the lingo. We'll talk a little bit about these other ones, blueprints, scenes, and scripts. Then we're going to jump back into here and go over those very quickly as well. Blueprints are reusable modules. You can create them yourself, or you can get a hold of the library of those that are being created by the community. Blueprints came in at the end of 2020 for Home Assistant, and they're probably one of the most powerful game changers I've seen in a while. Because it's almost like having an app store of automations that you can pull down and apply. Now, there's two really great things about this. The first is if somebody's done a really complex automation and figured out everything like, when the security camera detects motion, start recording. Cool. You can pull that in as a blueprint and say, I want to use my motion sensor and my camera and point it at your entities and be able to reuse their logic. That's super powerful that they can package that up and reuse it. You can also do this yourself if you have logic that you want to reuse without having to build out the entire automation. The second really important thing about blueprints that doesn't get mentioned a lot yet is it gives you a ton of ideas and a ton of inspiration. Sometimes home automation is all about, okay, I've got all this power, what do I do with it? And this is where you can see and browse through what other people have done that they found useful and kind of say, yeah, that applies to me. Maybe a farming one where it actually irrigates based on weather rainfall isn't as big a deal to me living here up in Washington where I get rainfall and I don't own a farm. But for somebody else, that might be the most critical thing that they need. And so when they see that automation, having that logic to be able to pull in is super powerful. The next thing I want to talk about is scenes. Scenes are almost like presets for your automations. And what's really cool about that is you can set up a scene, name it, and then use that in your automation, and you don't have to go and redo all those things. I'll give you an example of some scenes I use. I have one for movies. When I go to watch a movie, I want my lights in the front of the TV to be off, but I have the back of the room lights turned to 20%. That way, if I go back there for using the restroom or grabbing a snack or whatever, or if I have somebody else walking by as I'm watching a movie, they've got a little bit of light to guide them. That's my movie scene. I have a lights off scene, which is I'm going to bed or I'm leaving the home and I want everything downstairs off, including lights, TVs, and so on. That is a lot of entities at my house that have to be turned off to a certain state. Instead of saying all of those entities every time I have an automation for when I leave or when I go to bed, I can just say set the off scene for downstairs and they'll all happen. Finally, I have a cleaning scene where I have all my lights go all the way up. Makes things nice and bright and easy to clean. Now, say I add a lamp to my room. I don't have to go edit all of the automations in my home. I can just edit my scenes that affect that lamp and add that lamp to those scenes. Add them into those presets and everything gets updated automatically. It's a beautiful thing to be able to set up scenes in Home Assistant. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is scripts. Now, I talked about the concept of like me leaving home and turning off all my downstairs light by setting that scene. But I might also want to arm my alarm. Now, that would be a totally separate module of thing. I wouldn't want that to be part of that scene. I want it to be separate, but I do want it to happen when I have that action of leaving the house. What I would do is set up a script, and a script is where you can call multiple automations one after another. So when I leave the home, that would be my action. I can call a script of, arm house, and arming the house can arm the alarm, turn off the lights, and maybe lock the door, something like that, or close the garage door, stuff like that. So that's what a script is. It's a couple of automations that you do one after another. Okay, let's jump back in the UI and take a look at those now. All right, and we're back in the UI. Let's talk about blueprints. So we're on this automation screen here. We're gonna click over, there's a blueprint tab here. We can click on import blueprint in the lower right. And then we wanna give it the URL of the blueprint. Now, if you click on this community forums, it will take you to a page where you can browse through blueprints. And this is what I was talking about of all of these cool ideas that people have already done. For instance, sending camera snapshot notification on motion. Normally kind of challenging to do, but with this blueprint makes it very simple. Pick your notification, like your phone or however you want to be notified. Pick your camera, ready to go. Wake up light alarm with sunrise effect. The sunrise effect, the idea is that the light would change brightness and color intensity as it gets closer to your alarm. So this one here, very slick. We can just copy this URL and let's pull this in and take a look at it. Now, when you click on this, it will tell you all of the, basically it's like code. It gets updated, versioned, there's a description, there's basically all of the stuff you need to know. And if you take that URL and click it here, you can actually see a preview to make sure that you're pulling in something that you want. This is all of the work somebody has done that you don't have to deal with now. You can reuse their work, and instead of them pasting it in a forum and you having to replace everything, you simply import it and you're ready to go. Now here we go, let's see, this is the wake up light with sunrise effect. Let's take a look at it. These are my blueprints I pulled in. If I say create automation, then this is what it looks like to actually fill out. So basically they give me the things that I would want it to change. Now the entity, the wake up light, this is gonna be the light that I would want it to deal with. My makerspace light has that color intensity, I can do that. I'm going to do manual alarm time. I can actually, let's see, well, let's not wake up at 7. Let's wake up at 9. And sunrise duration, how long do I want this to happen for before 9? So we'll say 30 minutes. So this means it'll start at 8:30 and then till 9 it will slowly change these color temperatures. The brightness I want to go max out at. And then if I want to add other actions for pre-sunrise, I can do that as well. Maybe play some music. Now that was an incredibly complex, when we looked at that blueprint, you saw how complex all of that was that they had to do. However, I didn't have to do any of that work. I can reuse their work. And that's what I mean by reusable creative modules and how powerful this is. Okay, let's move over to scenes. Scenes, again, were like presets, right? So we're going to create this movie scene. We'll recreate it. Lower right corner again, add scene. And we'll just call it movie scene demo. Give it a name. This name's really important because if you have Nabu Casa installed, I'll talk about that in a future video, but if you do have it installed, these will get exposed as things that you can turn on and off via your Amazon speaker or Google speaker if you have one set up. Okay, so for this movie scene, I talked about how you can have devices and entities locked into a state. So the first thing you have to do is add them in here. So for my movie scene, my theater and my kitchen are adjacent. So what I would do is typically I set my theater light to off. So no brightness, it's off. That's where I would set it. And then my kitchen has these pendants that come down. And what I would do with those is I would set those to about 20%. And that's very dim, but it's just bright enough that people can see where they're going. And then the kitchen light in the back, I want that off. And the reason this is important for the scene is, say those lights were on and it only set the pendant and the theater light to what I want, the kitchen light would still be full on. So I actually want to make sure that everything is exactly how I want it for this scene. Now when I save it, it shows up in scenes. And now in an automation, I can simply say set scene instead of another action. Now, just to show you, here's the automation UI. There's triggers, conditions, and actions. And here, instead of setting a bunch of devices, I can just say activate scene. And there's my movie scene there. And when this activates, whatever the trigger is, it would set all of those lights that I just showed you would get set correctly. So that's how scenes work. Okay, let's talk about scripts. Now, scripts are going to be multiple actions that we can run in a row. I believe I mentioned it as automations, but really it can be quite a bit more than that. So here you can see there's action type, and we have all of our action types, but we also have a couple of new ones like choosing. We're going to have multiple conditions and do different things based on that. A script would be a really good way to do the light at 20% after 10 p.m. actually. Now, another thing we can do though is calling service. We can actually call an automation here. You can say automation trigger and pick any of the automations you have. So if I want to trigger that automation, I can do that and then add a separate action and trigger another automation. But it's also very powerful in that I can do things like fire events. We talked about scenes. I can activate scenes here. So a script is going to be multiple things here that can be done. But the choosing, I think, is incredibly powerful here of being able to choose different conditions and branching off to do different things in sequence. So scripts is where you kind of put your full program together of a whole bunch of stuff happening. Okay, so that was scripts, scenes, blueprints, automations, triggers, conditions, actions. That was a lot of stuff for this video. Hopefully that made sense and the demos made sense to you. I will try to do more videos in the future that talk about cool automation scenarios and how to hook them up. But for now, I just wanted you to know what was possible, what the terminology was, and where in the user interface to go to get them. One last thing I want to show real quick is you can actually go into Lovelace and add your automations as buttons. That's super handy here. You can do it by card, but again, the by entity makes this super easy. If you go to by entity, you'll see your automations. There'll be automation dot. This is the backyard motion capture for capturing video when my camera detects motion. I'm basically going to click that and select continue. And it gets it all set up for me. I can say add to Lovelace UI. And now I've got a nice little button here. Now if I want this automation to turn it on and off to disable it, I can also click here and say execute. And it'll start recording video. Thanks for watching. I'm Joe Farrow with Geek Toolkit. Until next time. Let's take that and apply it to homes with a very basic concept. I just made up a word, apply. There's also a NFC trigger.